The city of London, throughout its history, has had its fair share of struggles, like most major cities. In the early periods, it seemed as though it were at perpetual war with its enemy across the Channel. Later, at the height of the Industrial Revolution, London was cramped to the point that people were on top of people, causing disease to run rampant through the city. With this large concentration of people came new waves of criminal activity and new, deplorable ways to make a living. These years brought with them many things of a darker nature, and even an 1800s menace named Jack the Ripper, who victimized the city's working women of the East End. But today's story is not about Jack, but another, whom the papers bestowed the nickname the Blackout Ripper. A member of the Royal Air Force, whose killing spree took place over 6 days in the winter of 1942, claimed the lives of 4 and captured the attention of a nation. I'm Nick, your host, and welcome back for a new chapter of the Insidious Agenda podcast. This is chapter 42, the story of the famous killing spree of the Blackout Ripper, Gordon Frederick Cummins. Gordon Frederick Cummins was born in Western Terrace in the parish of New Earswick in the United Kingdom, a small town in the northern English county of North Yorkshire. New Earswick is known for having been constructed as a model village, a pseudo-self-contained community that had housing built of the highest quality and access to many amenities. Quite often, those living in these model communities were people in the upper middle and upper classes of society. Born on the 18th of February in 1914, Gordon was the son of John and Amelia Cummins. He was the second of 4 children the couple had conceived together, all of whom were boys. His older brother John, the oldest, was named after his father. It's believed that Gordon grew up in a strict household, mainly due to his father's employment. He was a civil servant who ran a school for rebellious and delinquent children. His mother Amelia, like many at the time, tended to domestic matters. Growing up in New Earswick and spending a great amount of time with his brothers, Gordon was never exposed to girls. He had no sisters, and there were none amongst the groups of children that he associated with. Gordon attended school at Vicar Pritchard's Intermediate Secondary School in Llandovery County, South Wales. Though George was fortunate to be able to grow up with a family that had means to send him to private school, he was found wanting in terms of his academic ability. But with everything that Gordon lacked in the academic front, he more than made up for in socialization. It makes sense that he cared more for socialization than academics, as the move to South Wales was because his father took a new position at a school. This took Gordon away from everything he knew. His home, his friends, the only life he had ever known. Gordon had to start over. The tough thing about moving to Wales is this also came with the challenge of having to learn a new language, so it's no wonder he suffered academically. It was following the transition to life in Wales that Gordon began to change things about himself. He had adopted a new way of speaking, like an accent that one might describe as snotty, aristocratic, or posh. This was all in an effort to grab the attention of his classmates and to make him stand out. Unfortunately, this change did nothing for him. He wasn't paid any extra attention. He made no new friends, and he began to decline rapidly, moving himself into self-isolation. recoiling from the world, his upbringing, his family, and himself. At some point during his tenure at the school, John Cummins, Gordon's father, was discovered embezzling money. One of the highest-ranking people in the institution was pilfering the coffers and was caught in the act. He vehemently proclaimed that he was innocent and never confessed to stealing the money. It was only when presented with an amount of evidence that can be considered dead to rights that John repaid what he owed. He was fired from his lofty position, and the Cummins family left Wales to return to England. They found a landing spot only 5 miles to the northwest of Northampton, in a town called Harrowing. Here, John took up the position as schoolmaster at Northampton Grammar, and his brother John was beginning studies to eventually become a teacher. Yes, John was able to secure another high position in his vocation, as if you remember back, he was never officially prosecuted for embezzlement, and he repaid the monies owed to kind of sweep this whole thing under the rug, so there was no black mark on his record officially. This event is important to remember for later in our story, and the key takeaway is that Gordon was pretending to be more than he was, and after watching his father get away with a criminal offense, we can only assume that this had some kind of impact on his cognitive development and his moral compass. Gordon went on to complete his schooling, with a heavy influence in his being passed through because of his father's position. He earned a diploma from Northampton Grammar School in chemistry at the age of 16 in 1930. From here, he moved over to the Northampton College of Technology. In his mid-teens, Gordon came into his body. He was a good-looking young man, complete with piercing blue eyes, fair hair, an eye-catching smile, a toned physique, and, as he never lost it, the near aristocratic-sounding voice. It certainly wasn't Gordon's laziness and lackadaisical attitude that found many young women attracted to him, but merely it was from his looks alone. As he had never been socially exposed to women in his youth, Gordon found a great amount of difficulty holding a conversation with them. Instead, he did what most insecure children do. He resorted to cockiness, lying, and showing off. In 1932, on the 1st of November, Gordon decided he no longer wanted to pursue education and removed himself from the Northampton Tech College. He left the city and moved over to the city of Newcastle upon Tyne, the birthplace of his mother. It was here Gordon took a position in the field of chemistry at Earswick Leather Goods. He didn't stay there very long and was let go from that position after only 5 months. His cause of termination was due to poor performance, spurred on by a lack of concentration. Simply put, Gordon was easily distracted by girls. At this point, it would start to form a thematic element in Gordon's life. Next, he tried his hand in leather working at Gordon Baker and Company, a tannery in Northampton. He held this position a little longer, being under employment for 13 months before he was unceremoniously fired. This time, for a lack of punctuality and many of the same reasons he was let go from his job in Newcastle. His employers here even went on to label him as abnormal and dense. When you look at his approach to academics versus socialization, we clearly see it translated well into his adult life. Especially so when you consider that after this, he only took work on a part-time and casual basis. In October of 1934, a now 20-year-old Gordon moved to London, continuing his work in leather processing at Reptile Dressers, a job that earned him a wage of £3 per week, a far cry from the life he pretended to lead. And of course, it had to be in London, one of the most expensive cities from a cost of living basis during the interwar period of history. Like he had during his early years, Gordon had a love of the finer things in life. Though his family were extremely well off, by a commoner's standards, he often found it necessary to not only further his position in life, but to make it appear to others that his means were well beyond what they were in reality. At this time, he was also trying to demonstrate to potential love interests that he was very affluent as well. Thus, the actions of petty crime began to seep into his life, and he became a thief. Now, Gordon was a better thief than he was at making honest money. Either that, or he was just plain lucky, as he was never caught or convicted of the offense. As with previous places of employment, Gordon was released from his employment with reptile dressers on the 8th of February in 1935. At this point, I don't have to tell you why, as Gordon's employment shared the same cyclical themes. It was who Gordon claimed to be that was perplexing to most. We know that he wanted to give off the air of affluence. He desired to live as a member of the aristocracy, and to achieve this, he frequented many well-off clubs and hotels in the West End of London. Here, he bragged to other patrons, using his newly formed Oxfordian accent, of the status and the peerage. He was the illegitimate son of someone with a heraldic title, even going so far as to present himself and asking others to call him the Honorable Gordon Cummins. He was proud of his financial means and his sexual exploits with members of the opposite sex, and he let everyone around him know. But we know his financial situation was not good, but we can't speak to his claimed promiscuity. Because of these things, he suffered professionally and was a detriment to himself and his continual employment. Gordon lived on the docks, on the south bank of the Thames, so it's quite possible that the close proximity to the bars and prostitutes may have been a part of his daily life, or, at a minimum, at least weighed heavily on his mind. Following his time down there, and because he spent his wages faster than he could pay rent, he was forced to move in with his brother. After moving into his brother's flat, he considered what course of employment he might pursue next. Sometime in the months that followed, Gordon decided he would give his life to the service of his country, and enlisted in the Royal Air Force at Regent's Park in London. When he was assessed as fit to join, he began his training as a rigger, a mechanic who was charged with the undertaking of pre-flight checks on aircraft. His first posting was to the Marine and Armament Experimental Establishment at Felixstowe in Suffolk. While in service to the RAF, his reputation was viewed differently by those in service. To his officers and senior enlisted members, as would later be noted by his commanding officer, Gordon was an ambitious young man. Meanwhile, to his fellow enlisted airmen, he wasn't held in such high regard. They grew tired of his showboating and saw through his false claims of a noble lineage, something that eventually earned Gordon the nickname the Duke among his peers, as a representation of their distaste for him. In May of 1936, it appeared his life might just turn around. He met a young woman named Marjorie Stevens at the Empire Air Days Air Show in Henlow. The pair hit it off. After a 7-month-long courtship, the two were married at the Paddington Register Office on the 28th of December in 1936. Now, unfortunately, we don't know very much about Marjorie from the point of her injection into Gordon's story. We do know that she was the secretary to a theatre producer in the West End, and she later went on to describe her marriage to Gordon as very, very happy. She described Gordon as never anything but kind, tolerant, and he treated her with every manner of respect. During his time with her, he wasn't a sex maniac or a pervert. He wasn't a drunkard, but had a few too many on occasion. During those times, he was never abusive, but it would instead become quiet, withdrawn, and normally passed out on his own. The pair had a steady income, but quite frequently, living the life of a military man, Gordon's duties took him across the country, as he was posted to many different RAF bases. After Felixstowe, he was transferred to Scotland and posted there between 36 and 39. As frequently as he could, Gordon travelled back to London's West End to be reunited with Marjorie. For some reason, whether it had been because of his time away or a factor unbeknownst to us, Gordon and Marjorie never had any children. When World War II broke out in 1939, he was transferred to Helensburgh in Dunbartonshire, where he stayed until April of 1941. When transferred to Fighter and Bomber Command at RAF Coleraine, he was promoted to leading airman. Through all of his travels, Gordon never lost the apple of his eye, which was to one day become a Spitfire pilot. In Coleraine, Gordon kept up his well-to-do persona, but began to go slightly off the rails. He frequently travelled into Bath, and was a frequenter of the city's brothels and the Queen Street's red light district. In his time posted here, many reports began to arise of women being robbed and beaten by a suspect only described as a fair-haired airman, and each crime occurred within miles of the RAF base. Several others had purses and handbags lifted from local watering holes and hotels, many of which Gordon was known to frequent, some of those that were even out of bounds to military personnel. None of these crimes could ever be traced back to Gordon, as he was posted out before the investigations were officially opened. And as no investigation ever convicted him, this situation remains circumstantial at best. On the 10th of November in 1941, Gordon was posted to RAF Cornwall. Here, his reputation followed, and he was no less of a showboat than he had been before, which earned him the second nickname, the Count. Wanting to assimilate into his new surroundings, Gordon joined the Blue Peter Social Club and assisted the proprietress with bartending duties. Everything seemed to be going well, until it wasn't. Only a matter of weeks into his time helping out at the club, Gordon was discovered to be giving free drinks to members of the RAF, and to make matters worse, the proprietress noticed that around 35 pounds worth of jewelry had been stolen from her apartment. I should note that in some cases the thievery also involves more apartments, and sometimes up to 1,000 pounds of jewelry and other items. Though she and the police suspected Gordon, he was never charged with thievery, and no evidence was found to prove that he was guilty. Sound familiar? In January of 1942, with his now 1,000-plus hours of flight experience, Gordon was successful in a tested aviation exam done by a board that earned him a transfer to Abbey Lodge at the Aircrew Receiving Center in Regent's Park, the same place he enlisted. He and another 300-some airmen were successful, with Gordon's results being labeled as exemplary. He was given orders to report for duty on the 2nd of February at 1000 hours. Working at St. John's Wood, Gordon left the establishment on Sunday the 8th of February to visit his wife at their nearby flat in Southwark. After their visit, he borrowed a £1 note from her, the equivalent of $60 by today's standards, and told her he was bound for a night on the town in the West End. He didn't return until 6:30 the following morning, and it should be noted that during this period the City of London was under blackout restrictions, as it had been since the war broke out in 1939, and the need especially for which was hammered home during the Blitz of London, which was a multi-month-long aerial bombardment of the city by the German Luftwaffe. This practice was meant to minimize the city as being a target for aerial bombardment by drastically reducing the light in each home after sundown. Sometime during the evening of February 13th, a young 18-year-old delivery boy named John Shine was delivering bottles of alcohol to a nearby establishment, the Captain's Cabin Pub. It was during this delivery that John came across something he didn't expect. He found a man rummaging through a woman's handbag, and next to him, the woman on the ground, unconscious. When noticed, the man fled the scene so as not to be discovered. Shine ran over to the woman, named Margaret Haywood. By the point he got over there, she had regained consciousness and let the boy know what happened. She had met the guy in Piccadilly. After they shared a drink and a sandwich at the London Trocadero, they began making their way toward Haymarket. The man began to become increasingly unpleasant and abruptly forward. He started groping her and asked if she would accompany him to a nearby air raid shelter. Reluctantly, she agreed to one kiss, and nothing further. In any case, she said, I wouldn't go in one with you. He then pushed her into a nearby doorway, and she tried to fight him, using her hands to push him back and trying to get him away from her body. The man went straight for her throat and pushed her back into the doorway. He began strangling her to the point of unconsciousness and repeating to her the phrase, "You won't." This was shortly before they were happened upon by Shine. John Shine offered to take Margaret to a nearby hospital to be examined, to which she agreed. Before they departed, Shine noticed something out of place on the ground. It was an RAF-issued gas mask and a haversack. He took it with him, and as the pair were making their way to the hospital, they ran across police officer James Skinner. Skinner asked the pair to follow him down to the West End Central Police Station, where he could take witness statements. Following this, a police officer could take Miss Haywood to the hospital. Shine handed over the items he recovered to Skinner, in hope that it would aid in the investigation. The statements were given at the police station, and the case was handed over to Detective Sergeant Thomas Shepherd. Shepherd was quick to note that the items bore the regimental number 525987. That meant two things. They belonged to someone in the military, and that they would be easily traceable. Shepherd quickly contacted the military police with the regimental number. When the military police confirmed it was Gordon Cummins, they called over to his regiment at Regent's Park, where a staff sergeant on duty confirmed the items were issued to Cummins, and Detective Shepherd was informed. The duty sergeant also confirmed around 11:30 p.m. that Gordon Cummins was not at the home where he was billeted. The following morning, Gordon Cummins was brought in for questioning. He told Detective Shepherd that he was innocent. Gordon's story was that he had spent the evening drinking whiskey and bitters with another corporal at the Volunteer Public House on Baker Street, following which the two climbed into a cab over to Shaftesbury Avenue. Here, they drank several shots before Cummins attempted to put the moves on a young woman. He claimed to only have a hazy recollection of being in her company, but did remember walking the streets with her. When he realized he was out after curfew, Gordon returned promptly to the base. He didn't have any recollection of attacking Miss Haywood, but stated that if he had, then he was extremely regretful, and even offered payment as compensation. Shepherd noticed during the questioning that Cummins's left knuckles were cut up and bandaged, which Gordon stated had happened during maintenance on an aircraft engine. Gordon gave an official statement for which happened on the evening and was remanded into custody on one charge of causing grievous bodily harm. Little did he know, but things were about to get a whole lot worse than they were. But the question remains as to why. What happened to Gordon Cummins between the night of February 8th and his assault on Margaret Haywood on the 13th? Well, the following events outline how Gordon Cummins will forever be remembered as the Blackout Ripper. On the morning of February 9th, in 1942, the body of 41-year-old pharmacist Evelyn Margaret Hamilton was discovered in an air raid shelter in Montague Place by an electrician named Harold Batchelor. Local police chief superintendent Frederick Cherrill was called in to investigate the scene. Cherrill was affectionately known as Fingerprint Man and was your true British detective, even to the point of surveying crime scenes with a magnifying glass, attempting to locate just that: fingerprints. He noted her body was face up in the gutter and surrounded by bits of broken mortar, which were indicative of a struggle prior to the victim's death. Her skirt was raised up above her hips, and her underwear pulled down below her knees, and her right breast was left exposed. It appeared that the body was left that way only for shock and awe, as there was no sign of attempted sex before or after the murder. Hamilton's handbag was also noticed missing, which was known to have contained approximately 80 pounds. The other contents were strewn about outside the shelter, and the bag was later recovered on Wyndham Street. Cherrill was unable to locate any fingerprints for the assailant, and it was through Hamilton's landlady, Catherine Jones, that she was identified. Evelyn Hamilton was fortunate to have grown up in a well-off household in the northeast of England, having been raised by her sister, a young widow who was the inheritant of her husband's robust life insurance policy. Evelyn graduated from the University of Edinburgh with degrees in chemistry and pharmacology. The day prior to her murder, Hamilton had been let go from her management position at Hornchurch Chemists and given 1 month's pay as severance. From here, she traveled to London. I should note here that her being let go wasn't performance-based, but the fact she had to be let go because of a significant downturn in business. She spoke with another local shortly before 7 p.m. on the 8th of February, a Mrs. Maud Yoxall, about her plans to travel to the county of Lincolnshire, as she was to take up a position in Grimsby, managing a pharmacy there. The last time Evelyn was seen alive was consuming a glass of wine at the Maison Lyon corner house in Marble Arch. In celebration of her 41st birthday, Evelyn's final meal was only 2 slices of bread and beetroots. Evelyn seemed to lead a sad life, as she was known as a solitary figure with no close friends and no husband. Detectives surmised that she was killed either on the way to her lodgings that evening or early the next morning. After the autopsy was complete, the cause of death was manual strangulation by an individual who was left-handed. It was confirmed she hadn't been sexually assaulted or mutilated. Around 8:30 the following morning, the 10th of February, 2 police officers out doing meter reads discovered the body of 34-year-old Evelyn Oatley in her bed in her flat, located at 153 Wardour Street in Soho. Evelyn's naked body was found mutilated. She had suffered beatings to the mouth and chest. It was determined that she was strangled unconscious before a 6-inch slash was cut across her throat, a slash that completely severed her right carotid artery. Evelyn's abdomen, genitals, and thighs were mutilated, and evidence of sexual assault was present. The instruments of her murder, still at the scene, were determined to be the blade of a safety razor and a tin can opener. The mutilation was done upon her after she was already dead. The instrument used to sexually assault her, a flashlight, was still found lodged within her. In addition, a set of curling tongs were found near her body. The contents of her handbag were scattered about the floor. The door was found closed, not locked, and no defensive wounds were present on her hands, nails, or forearms, indicating that Evelyn was likely asleep, or was completely caught off guard when the assailant found her. Evelyn Oatley grew up in Lancashire and had dreams of becoming a singer, dancer, and actress in the West End. She became enveloped in a scandal when she was only 15, having been impregnated by an unnamed male figure. Evelyn saw the pregnancy through, but had to put the child up for adoption, a child that was eventually petitioned by a Canadian family. Because of this incident, the scandal followed her throughout her life, and she ended up marrying a poultry farmer named Harold Oatley. After failed attempts at becoming an actress, she gave up the dream and became a nightclub hostess before turning to prostitution. It was once again Frederick Cherrill that was called to the scene to examine it. He was able to recover fingerprints from the now blood-stained can opener. Another set he was able to extract from a section of broken mirror that was in her handbag. A key piece here is that the mirror was undoubtedly used in the act of murder, and the assailant was again left-handed. Much like the murder of Evelyn Hamilton, when the fingerprints were run through the Fingerprint Bureau, no match was noted. This told Cherrill that the fingerprints belonged to someone the police had never encountered before. At least in the eyes of Cherrill and Detective Sidney Birch, a close partner of Cherrill's from Scotland Yard, they had their first piece for uncovering the identity of the killer. The last time Evelyn was seen alive was around 11:40 p.m. on the night of the 9th by fellow tenant Ivy Poole in the stairwell of their residence. 3 eyewitnesses to seeing her afterward came forward. They indicated that she had been in the company of a young, clean-cut man with a mustache. He had chestnut brown hair and was about 5'8" in height. The pair were outside a restaurant on Shaftesbury Avenue. They recalled that, when the man was asked what his sexual preference were, he replied that he liked blondes. Ms. Poole recalled being awoken in the midst of the night when there was a notable increase in noise coming from Oatley's room, but she chose not to investigate. It might seem like Ivy Poole should have investigated, but after all, Oatley was a known prostitute, and had been since about 1939, which, because of the nature of her work, would have explained the noise. In the early hours of February 11th, the killer struck again. This time, his victim was 43-year-old working girl Margaret Florence Lowe. Margaret Lowe was another known prostitute in the area, who had a rough decade leading up to this instance. She was from the town of Southend-on-the-Sea, and endured the loss of her husband in 1932. Margaret was forced to sell her family's fancy goods business to help support her and her daughter. Before moving to London, Lowe enrolled her daughter in a boarding school to further her education. Margaret was able to find work as a house cleaner in the years that followed, but found it incredibly tough to make ends meet, having to both support herself and make enough money to keep her daughter in school. Margaret Lowe had no choice but to turn to a life of prostitution. She ensured her daughter wasn't aware of the things she had to do to keep her in school, and every third weekend, when Barbara would come to London, the pair spent their weekends doing things like seeing movies and visiting different parts of the city. Margaret Burkett, as she was then known, was born in 1899 and was a native of Napier, New Zealand, an idyllic coastal town. For reasons lost to history, her family relocated to England when she was young. They came to reside in a small, cramped house in Hoxton on the East End. Her father was killed in action during the First World War, which severely encumbered the family financially. At only the age of 20, Margaret was booked for the first time for prostitution. She was fortunate to meet and marry a man named Frederick Gordon Lowe, keeping her off the streets for a time before she was forced back due to his death. Among the other working women, Margaret was known for being unhappy and a loner, things that can be attributed to what happened in her life in the decade prior. She liked to work at night and was well-spoken, often seen wearing a fur coat. Known affectionately as the Lady, Margaret harbored a hatred for both her clients and other prostitutes. The last time Margaret was seen alive was by her neighbor, Florence Bartolini, around 1:15 that morning. Lowe had a successful night, and she was witnessed bringing a man down to her flat. Sometime later, Bartolini heard the man exit the flat. He walked calmly down the hall, whistling as he went, and exited the building alone. Florence hadn't noticed Lowe the following day, and it wasn't until shortly after noon on the 13th that she was discovered. Lowe's daughter Barbara had come to pay her a visit. When Bartolini told her she hadn't been seen in a few days, even showing her the unclaimed package outside her door for the same amount of time, the pair were gravely concerned. They called over to the local police detachment, and Chief Superintendent Cheryl arrived at the scene. What he found when he gained entry was horrifying. Margaret Lowe was found lying in her bed, underneath the covers that were pulled up to her chin. Pulling back the covers, she was lying on her back, with her legs apart and knees bent upward. Her body showed extensive signs of physical torment, and the cause of her death was strangulation by the way of a silk stocking, one that was knotted around her neck on the right-hand side. In the words of forensic examiner Sir Bernard Spilsbury, Margaret Lowe's murder was quite dreadful. The perpetrator was a savage sexual maniac who indulged in a wicked lust to perpetrate the most diabolical injuries on the women he killed. This had been the killer's worst murder yet. The body of Margaret Lowe was, like Oatley's, horribly mutilated, but in this case, slightly worse, as some of the wounds were inflicted while she was still alive. Some of the items found near her, or dislodged from her, were a razor blade, a vegetable paring knife, a table knife, and a fireplace poker. Her abdomen had been sliced open, leaving her organs exposed. Another slash was inflicted to the right side of her groin, about 10 inches in length. A wax candlestick had been shoved up inside her, and a slash was cut across her uterus. The examiner noted that many of the wounds found on Lowe were similar to those on Oatley. Cheryl was able to find a set of fingerprints on the glass candlestick holder that had been separated from the candlestick and confirmed his left-handed assailant theory. The second night that Margaret Lowe hadn't been seen, February 12th, the assailant was at it again. This night, he roughed up 25-year-old working girl Catherine Mulcahy on Regent Street. Mulcahy was a prostitute that often went under the working name Kathleen King. Catherine met the man and agreed to go to her flat on Southwick Street. The man was an attractive customer, having agreed to pay the £2 fee in advance. When the pair arrived, she lit her fireplace to warm up the flat, and the pair began to undress. As she took her clothes off, Catherine noticed a strange smile start to come across the man's face. Nonetheless, she stripped down, laid on the bed, and motioned for the man to come and join her. When he got into bed, he immediately drove his knees into her stomach, and then his hands made for her neck. He intended to strangle the life from Catherine, as he had done to the others, but she fought back. Catherine kicked and screamed, finally able to get free of his grasp. She connected with a kick that sent him out of bed and down to the floor. Catherine ran from her flat to the house of a nearby neighbor. In an effort to deter her from calling the police, the man took time to partially get dressed before going over to the neighbor's house. As Catherine shouted from behind the protection of her neighbors, the man gave her another £8 and told them, "I'm sorry. I think I had too much to drink this evening." He picked up his coat and left, but the man didn't realize he forgot his issued RAF webbing behind. His final successful victim was another working girl, albeit one that only worked on occasion. A 32-year-old named Doris Jouanet, who often went by Olga. The last time Doris was seen alive was around 10:20 p.m. on the 12th of February, having been noticed by friend Beatrice Long. After sharing a drink, Doris told Long that she was heading out to visit a regular client of hers, someone she only referred to as the Captain. They went their separate ways, and only a short time later, Doris came across another client, who was quite possibly on his way from his interaction with Catherine. He propositioned her for sex, she accepted, and brought him to her flat at 187 Sussex Gardens, a flat that Doris shared with her husband. She met her husband, as he was previously a client of hers, in November of 1935. After her marriage, she only resorted to selling herself if the family needed a few extra shillings to supplement her husband's income. He was a hotel manager in Sloane Square. They had an understanding, and Doris kept her nighttime activities to when he would have to manage the hotel overnight. The couple were married in 1935, when Doris was 25, and Henry, a native of France, was 60. When her husband arrived home the following evening, he noticed something peculiar. The bedroom door was locked. After unsuccessful attempts to pry the door open, he phoned the police for assistance. The police dispatched Constable William Payne to assist Henri. Payne told Henri to wait in the hallway, in the event something diabolic had occurred. Payne was able to gain access, and lit his flashlight to see inside. There, he discovered Doris's body, lying diagonally across the bed, dressed in an open black nightgown. Her left hand was placed between her legs. He backed away, telling Henri, "I must advise you not to go into that room." Payne returned to the Paddington police station and requested that the duty officer inform Scotland Yard and the division surgeon. It should also be noted that Doris Jouanet's body was discovered just as the crime scene investigation for Margaret Lowe was getting underway. The first to arrive was Division Detective Leonard Clare, just after 8 p.m. The injuries inflicted on Doris were severe. Her jaw was broken, discovered to have been broken before she was strangled. A stocking was found knotted underneath her chin, much like Margaret Lowe. There was extensive mutilation to her abdomen, genitals, left breast, and thighs, all having been done with a razor blade. A gash was found on her vagina in the length of 6.5 inches. Flesh had also been carved away from below her breast. The knife, after serving its purpose, was left to rest on her thigh. 2 condoms were found lying on the floor beside the bed, empty, and 5 pounds was discovered stolen. When the autopsy was conducted the following day, the physician determined that she was strangled to the point of death before any wounds were inflicted, with the exception of her jaw. It was also the opinion of the examiner that the killer showed a good amount of restraint when he started cutting, but quickly sputtered into a frenzy. In the media, the murders hadn't garnered much attention, as there were restrictions placed on newsprint because of the war. That being said, some articles were present. Once news broke of the murders of Lowe and Jouanet, it became the talk of the West End. Many working girls chose not to offer services to those who were not regular clientele, and it was through the press that we were finally given the nickname the Blackout Ripper. Eventually, word spread across all of England. And this is where we return to the point in our story after the assault on Margaret Heywood. To further their investigation, the police began to dive deeper into the habits of Gordon Cummins. When they examined the logbooks at his billet, every night, on the nights that each murder occurred, he had arrived before 10:30 p.m. The only issue with this is that each of the entries was written in pencil, so any amendments to it could be made easily. There were also many check-ins for Cummins during the month of February that were omitted, although this was explained away by many other service members. When interviewed, they stated they would often cover for one another when their fellow service members were coming in late, and neglecting to sign the book entirely to cover their tracks. The fellow airmen also made note they had witnessed Gordon's spending habits in the week leading up to his arrest exponentially increase for a reason unbeknownst to them. The chief inspector for the case, Edward Greeno, even uncovered that Cummins and a fellow airman named Felix Sampson were able to scamper out their billet's fire escape after curfew on each of the nights in question. Next, they took to examining Gordon's quarters. They found something common amongst many serial killers. Among his possessions were trophies, something taken from each of the victims as a keepsake. Each of these items could be traced back to each one of the Blackout killer's victims. Forensics also found traces of blood on clothing in his kit bag and on his belt. His uniform showed traces of brick dust, the same composition that was found in the air raid shelter of his first victim, Evelyn Hamilton. Chief Superintendent Cheryl even turned up a positive match when comparing fingerprints taken from Cummins while in custody to the broken mirror shard possessed by Evelyn Oatley. That, in addition to matching them to the two other crime scenes. They even went as deep as to examine the banknotes that he had given to Catherine Mulcahy. As the notes were brand new, detectives traced the serial numbers on them and confirmed that they had been issued to Gordon on the 12th of February, the day of the attack on Catherine. Next, they brought Mulcahy and Margaret Haywood in for a lineup of suspects. Although Catherine was unable to pick her attacker, Margaret had no issue and knew instantaneously that her assailant was Cummins. The official interview of Cummins was held by Edward Greeno on Monday the 16th of February in 1942. Gordon told him a version of his movements of what happened between the 9th and the 13th. He claimed to have never encountered any of the victims and was unable to identify any of the women in the photographs he was shown. Next, he was presented with trophies that were taken from his victims and recovered at his billet. Naturally, this wasn't his fault either. They were taken from a service respirator case that I was carrying when you arrested me, but which is not mine, Cummins told Greeno. In his opinion, he was being framed by another airman. Now, there's a fact I haven't told you yet that I was saving until now. After his failed attempt on Margaret Haywood's life, Gordon ducked into a nearby pub. Whether to drown his worry or to attempt to blend in if the police were after him, it's unknown. Here, he realized that he left his gas mask and haversack at the crime scene, something that would surely be turned into police and could easily be traced back to him. In an effort to create his own alibi, he stole the gas mask and haversack of another airman before he returned to base. There was no way Gordon was going to sidestep this. On the 16th, he was charged with the murders of Evelyn Oatley, Margaret Lowe, and Doris Juanet. In addition, on the 20th, he was charged with assaulting Catherine Mulcahy and Margaret Haywood. On the 27th of March, he was brought before a judge at the Bow Street Magistrates Court for a hearing. At this hearing, he was also charged with the murder of Evelyn Hamilton, his first victim. The first day of Cummins' trial was the 24th of April, 1942, being held at the Old Bailey, a building known today as the Central Criminal Court of England and Wales. Presiding over this case was Judge Cyril Asquith. Gordon Cummins entered a plea of not guilty. After entering the plea into the record, the court clerk then read to the jury, "The prisoner at the bar, Gordon Frederick Cummins is charged upon indictment with the murder of Evelyn Oatley on the 10th day of February this year. To this indictment, he has pleaded not guilty. It is your charge to say, having heard the evidence, whether he be guilty or not. It was noted on many occasions that Gordon had no interest in being present, and he was often witnessed having sidebar conversations with his lawyers, or turning around in his chair to wave at his wife Marjorie. You should also know that Marjorie, this entire time, even up to her death many decades later, held the sentiment that her husband Gordon was nothing short of innocent. There was a legal technicality on the first day of his trial surrounding the presentation of evidence to the jury, so the initial jury to try Cummins was dismissed. A new one was selected, and the trial resumed 3 days later. The prosecutors for the case were King's Council members Christmas Humphreys, G.B. McClure, and Dennis Noel Pritt. For his defense were counselors John Flowers and Victor Durand. The first evidence presented to the jury was the outline of Evelyn Oatley's body and the instruments used to murder and mutilate her. Humphreys argued that the fingerprints recovered at the crime scene matched those of Gordon Cummins. You will hear from one of the greatest experts in the country on fingerprints, he said. He will tell you that there have been some 500,000 fingerprints taken at this time, and that no two have ever been alike. The prosecution would ask you to say, each one of you, that you are satisfied on the evidence which will be called before you, and nothing else. That this is the man who murdered Mrs. Oatley on the 10th of February. The prosecution's first witness was none other than Detective Chief Superintendent Frederick Cherrill, a man willing to stake his personal reputation that the fingerprints taken from Oatley's mirror matched those of Gordon Cummins. The defense argued that the fingerprint was too faint for a precise identification. As there were photos of the fingerprints in the courtroom, Cherrill made note that as they were incredibly magnified, if there was any deviation, the differences would be obvious. Following Cherrill was Sir Bernard Spilsbury, the forensic examiner, prepared to testify to his autopsy. He revealed the cause of death to be a deep slash to the throat and subsequent bleed-out, which he estimated took about 5 minutes, with death shortly occurring around midnight. Third to the stand was Felix Sampson, Gordon Cummins's fellow airman and running mate that had been sneaking out with him after hours. On the 9th of February, Sampson said that they had gotten into it with 2 prostitutes in Piccadilly. The girls in question were Molly de Santos Alves and 22-year-old blonde Laura Denmark. Denmark also testified to her evening with Cummins as well. When Laura agreed to go with Gordon, the pair passed by another working girl, who Laura knew as Leda Ward, but we know as Evelyn Oatley. That evening, she was wearing a bright red jumper and smoking cigarettes while struggling to stay warm in the cold night of the winter. The pair were headed down to Laura's flat on Frith Street after they had been overindulging in Canadian whiskey at the Brasserie Universelle. When they arrived at the flat, Laura heated up the room and began to undress. Gordon tried to get himself hard by staring at her, but wasn't able to. Laura noted that Gordon had a look of desperation about him and admitted defeat with the phrase, "It's gone." The pair cuddled up together on her bed, laughing and joking for the next half hour. When they tried to make a second go at it, they met the same result, which Gordon politely blamed on their drinking. They walked back to Piccadilly, and he told her, "I wish you all the best, and I hope you earn more money tonight." He left into the dark, leaving her with the impression that he was nothing but, in her words, polite, courteous, and a real gentleman. He seemed a very decent sort of chap, and was very respectful to me. When he departed from Laura's company, This was approximately 1 hour before Oatley's murder took place. Sampson confirmed that he waited for Gordon outside the restaurant for about 25 minutes, leaving around 11:30 before heading into a pub. When he returned to their billet around 6 a.m., he found Gordon asleep in bed. The next morning, Gordon told him that he got in around 3:30 or 4. "The woman I went with didn't satisfy me," Gordon told him, "so I went and found someone else." When Gordon Cummins testified to his own defense on the 27th of April, he continued to express his innocence. He told the court he had lied on his initial statement, stating that he and Felix got together outside the Café Monaco around 10 p.m. This also contradicted the testimony given by Sampson. Cummins stated that he felt intimidated by Inspector Greeno on the 16th. He professed that Greeno told him, "We have a rope around your neck and we're going to hang you with it." He said the evening in question that he was too drunk to actually recollect any specific timings or locations that confirmed his whereabouts. "I had not a watch myself," Gordon told the court, "and, of course, in the dark, one cannot see the public clocks." Closing arguments were presented on the 28th of April, and Judge Asquith issued his final instructions to the jury. After an hour-long speech and recap by the jury retired to deliberate. After only 35 minutes, they had reached a verdict. All members of the jury were noted, when filing back in, that each member declined to make eye contact with Cummins. The jury foreman informed the court that they found Gordon Frederick Cummins guilty of murder. As the verdict was read, Cummins displayed no emotion whatsoever. The same couldn't be said for his wife Marjorie, who shattered and couldn't hold back her tears. When Judge Asquith asked Cummins if there was any reason that he should not impose the death penalty, Gordon only replied, "I am completely innocent, sir." As the judge proceeded to sentencing, Gordon Frederick Cummins was to be executed, death by hanging. In the judge's words, "Gordon Frederick Cummins, after a fair trial, you have been found guilty and on a charge of murder. As you know, there is only one sentence that the law permits me to pronounce, and that is that you be taken from this place to a lawful prison and thence to a place of execution, and that you there be hanged by the neck until you are dead. And may God have mercy on your soul." When sentencing was complete, Gordon Cummins was transported to Wandsworth Prison in southwest London, where he awaited his execution. He had no concern for the predicament he had put himself in, and did attempt to appeal that was turned down in June. On the 25th of June, the sentence was carried out by English hangman Albert Pierrepont, a hangman who had a 25-year career. During that career, Pierrepont had executed between 450 and 600 criminals. Reports indicate that Cummins was given a glass of brandy to calm his nerves before he walked to the scaffold with 2 guards. He put up no resistance and was hung by the neck until his death. The entire sentence was carried out within 2 minutes. Interestingly enough, that while the execution was taking place, the city of London was facing an air raid from Germany, making Gordon Cummins the only person in history to be executed during such an event. Afterward, he was taken down and buried within the confines of Wandsworth Prison. Up until the day of his execution, Cummins did nothing but protest his innocence, a sentiment that was shared by his wife, Marjorie. She continued to visit him right up to the day of his execution. He was never convicted on the murders of Evelyn Hamilton, Margaret Lowe, or Doris Jeannot. There exist 2 other murders as well, that police believe had been done by Cummins while he was posted to RAF Coleraine. Those of 19-year-old clerk Maple Churchyard on the 13th of October in 1941, and 48-year-old widow Edith Eleonora Humphreys on the 17th. Both were suspected to have been killed by a left-handed killer, and their assailant was never captured. Both victims were robbed of money and personal effects, and they were both killed in close proximity to one another and the RAF base. And there you have it, the story of Gordon Cummins, the man the papers called the Blackout Killer. We'll never know why Cummins did what he did, as again, he proclaimed his innocence right up until the end, therefore never offering anything by way of an explanation. Was he simply a psychopath? Someone following in the steps of the infamous Jack the Ripper? Did his ego or narcissism spur him on to murder these women? An interesting theory has it that as Gordon wanted to be more than he was, and seemed to have convinced himself of that fact, that he might have suffered from impotence. Else, what reason would he have for having assaulted and mutilated Oatley, Lowe, and Jeannot, as horribly as he did? But Laura Denmark got off with only a positive impression. Was it that she showed him compassion, when the others might have mocked him? Was he only looking to be given that opening to satisfy some parts of his mind that needed the humiliation to drive his murders? As I mentioned, we'll never know. The only thing we do have is that in the winter of 1942, a killer was loose in London in the midst of a spree that lasted 6 days. The evidence and testimony points towards proving the guilt of Gordon Frederick Cummins and unmasking the Blackout Killer. But was Cummins truly innocent, as he so proclaimed? The only ones who will ever know for sure are his victims. With this message, we bring to close the story of Gordon Frederick Cummins and his murderous spree as the criminal known as the Blackout Ripper. I hope you enjoyed listening to today's episode and learned about a historical event you might have never known before. For further reading, please check out the references in the show notes. And before you go, I'd really appreciate it if you could give us a thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube, or click the review button if listening from another app. And remember to subscribe so you can find your way back next week for another amazing episode. New episodes of the Insidious Agenda podcast release every Tuesday at midnight, Eastern Standard Time. But for now, it's time to close the cover of the Insidious Agenda. As always, I've been your host, Nick, and I look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you for listening.